Good afternoon. My name is Jason Garrick, and just to kick things off, I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Jagera and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm from Central Queensland, so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I come from. The Barada people of Middlemount, the Gungalu people of Blackwater, and the Darringal people of Rockhampton. In presenting today, I'd also like to acknowledge the LGBTIQA+ leaders, past, present and future, for their advocacy, their love, their openness. For without them, I would not experience the freedoms that I do today. Today is also Ida Hobbit. Has anyone seen that in social media so far today? Yeah? Okay, excellent. So, today is the International Day against homophobia, biphobia and transphobia and interphobia or intersexism. It's about acknowledging the work that has gone into the community and work into legal structures, social structures and cultural structures to make our society more inclusive and the doors open for participation. So, by way of introduction, for those who don't know me, I do know quite a few of you. My name is Jason Garrick and I'm a lawyer in the Violence Prevention and Women's Advocacy team. I identify as a cisgendered gay man. My preferred pronouns are him and he. So, today we're going to be talking about gender, sexuality and breaking the binary. We're going to be talking about some key terms and language to avoid. We're going to be talking about kids. Kids are all right. Domestic and family violence in LGBTIQA+ families, and also the barriers to participation in the domestic and family violence framework. And where to from here? That's more of a question for you, but we'll get there. So why are we here? Well, firstly, for those who aren't aware of this document, the Queensland Public Sector LGBTIQ+ Inclusion Strategy, 2017 to 2022, identifies that we have a responsibility to serve and make the best decisions for all our customers, including Queensland's LGBTIQ+ community. We need to actively recognise we must actively recognizing the diversity that exists in the LGBTIQ+ community and value the experience of LGBTIQ+ employees. Not only enables a deeper understanding of the community's needs, but also creates empathy, promotes new ways of thinking and drives innovation. So, before we start, some of these concepts might be a bit challenging, and I accept that. We are conditioned to see the world through certain lenses, and that is to see gender as male and female, and sexuality to be heterosexual or heteronormative. So we're actually going to deal with gender as a complex concept in itself. Gender is the complex interrelationship between three dimensions of body, identity, and expression. Our body, our experience of our own body, and how society genders bodies, and how others interact with us based on our body. That is the physical attributes that we hold. Our identity is something which is far more deeply held. It's an internal sense of self. It might be masculine, feminine, a blend of both, neither, or something else. Identity also includes the name we use to convey our gender. Gender identity can correspond to or differ from the sex we are assigned at birth. Expression, how we present our gender in the world and how society, culture, community, and family perceive, interact with, and try to shape our gender. Gender expression is also related to gender roles and how society uses those roles to try to enforce conformity to current gender norms. We must accept that the Western culture views gender at the first point as a binary concept. The World Health Organization defines gender as the result of socially constructed ideas about the behaviour, activities and roles a particular sex performs. So that's the starting point. I hope I haven't lost anyone yet. Now, the next point So moving beyond gender, let's talk about sexuality. Sexuality is not about who you have sex with, ultimately. Sexuality is about your sexual feelings, your thoughts, attractions, and behaviours towards other people. Sexuality is diverse and personal. I'd also like to acknowledge some stats. There are distinct differences between the mental health and well-being of younger LGBTI people and older LGBTI people specifically. Young people are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers of a similar age. Young people are nearly twice as likely to engage in self-injury than their peers of a similar age. Young people aged between 16 and 24 have a higher rate of being diagnosed with a mental disorder as opposed to older LGBTI people. Young people between 16 and 24 have the highest level of psychological distress across all age groups. Rates of psychological distress for gay men, lesbian women, bisexual women and trans women decline with age. So a few of you may have been familiar with the social media campaign of about 5 years ago. It gets better. It does, in fact, get better, and the research supports that. It's also important to note that psychological distress amongst trans men were consistently high across all age groups. And the number of transgender people who meet the criteria for depressive or anxiety disorder also decreases with age. So what we do understand is that vulnerability does decrease, but there are still significant issues in a person reaching that point. So I want you to keep that in mind as we move towards a case example at the end of this seminar. I'm going to be talking about I'm going to try to fly through this because I could have probably a whole morning talking about general terminology and key concepts which impact on the LGBTIQA+ community. And I'm sorry if I speak really quickly at times or just jump over a few, so I do apologise in advance. So we're going to talk about sexual orientation, we're going to talk about sex, we're going to talk about gender identifiers, gender identity and gender expression, and then we're going to be talking about the broader LGBTIQA+, which I admit is a very long acronym. There is a movement in social sciences to move away from that acronym and use the term gender and sexually diverse. There is a reason for that because the social science is starting to indicate a very, very strong leaning towards that gender is actually fluid. Sexuality is fluid, and it's more of a sliding scale as opposed to left or right. Other key concepts, heteronormativity and what is heteronormative. I wrote a 10,000 word thesis on this in law school and how law reinforces the heteronormative view. So to do that in 45 minutes is pretty hard. So I'm not going to be going about that. I'm going to be talking about coming out, being out or outed, allies, and of course the phobias. So sexual orientation, that's a person's emotional, romantic or sexual feelings towards others based on attraction, not behaviour. It's not a choice. So tips, avoid talking about sexual preference when you're talking to a client. Avoid talking about their lifestyle. Don't use those words. And also, your sexual identity, again, we're moving away from those languages. And that's in line with the Queensland Arts Council Good Practice Guide, but also the Queensland Public Sector Inclusion Strategy. Sex refers to a person's biological or physical characteristics. Anatomy. Plain and simple. It's traditionally described as male, female, or intersex, the three, and I need to enforce that there is no connection between sex and gender identity. Gender identity refers to a person's internal and personal sense of identity in relation to categories of male or female. Some people don't identify as male or female. Gender identity can be separate from biological sex and may change over a person's life. Gender expression is a person's public presentation of their gender, including but not limited to their name, their preferred pronouns, their dress, their hair, their body language and voice. And again, avoid those words when you're talking about a person's gender expression. Gender identity is separate to a gender expression. Heteronormativity and the heteronormative. So that's the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm and there are two distinct binary genders with natural roles in life. That's a pretty big one in terms of what we do and how our clients perceive law, how they perceive social responses to issues in our community, domestic violence being the one that I see the most of. They see it can be seen and viewed in the LGBTIQA+ community as a model which is inherently gender biased and not considerate of the vulnerabilities of the LGBTIQA+ community. Because it assumes that violence is gendered, and when you're dealing with a population which is gender diverse, that view can sometimes create an invisible barrier to participation, to reporting, to referring, and for seeking assistance and help. Now, coming out or being outed, I think that's anyone confused about the process of being outed or being out. I'm a very out guy. I've been I've been out for 10 years on the 9th of April. So I remember that very well. I remember telling my mum, and I remember her saying, "Are you sure?" It's like, "No, Mum, it's just a new thing that I'm trying out." So it's really important, and I know that we have a bit of a laugh at that. My mum is the most supportive woman that a mother that I could have. But it's very important that we don't actually use language which we say a person admits that they're gay or that they confess to be somewhere on the gender and sexually diverse spectrum. Really, really important, because that reinforces that there's something different. Practice point: when you're dealing with a client at duty law or the first time that you're meeting them, allow a person to come out to you. Don't seek their admission or espouse to have always knowing that they may be somewhere on that spectrum. Avoid that language, because again, it creates barriers, it heightens their sense of fear. There is often a social science perspective that you're constantly outing yourself. Personally, yep. All the time, constantly. It can actually get people really, really down. I'm a bit different. I'm 6'4", built like a brick unit, and I've been raised in a way and surrounded by people who lift me up. So that's not what everyone has. An important point, which I will get to very shortly, is actually about how much privilege I experience because I'm white and I'm male and I'm gay. That puts me right to the top of the pile in terms of privilege. I've not had to deal with a culturally and ethnically diverse family or family unit. I've not had to experience racism as a multifactorial disadvantage. It is something that does affect our community very significantly and at its roots. So it is something that everyone, when you start hitting those multifactorial parts of a person's gender or sexual diversity, you can actually have multiple issues which impact on a person's participation in the world, how they answer questions, how they're prepared to put forward ideas and concepts in legal settings. Phobias: fear, hatred, or discomfort with people who are or perceived to be of gender or sexually diverse community. It manifests in discrimination, harassment, vilification, or violence. See further the concepts of societal homophobia and internalised homophobia. There is a great book called The Velvet Rope, written by an American psychiatrist, about the experiences of gay men in a heterosexual world and how to be successful you have to let go of aspects of what might make you camp, what might make you more feminine, and those kinds of things. There are a lot of, there's quite a gender balance in this room, I think. Anyway, a lot of this, if I can encourage participants today to think about it like this. Sexism. Sexism affects 50% of the world. It exists. In the same way, homophobia affects that entire population subset. It is there. You might not see it because you might be surrounded by wonderfully inclusive people. It's there. So, allies. There are a lot of allies in this room. They're a person who supports LGBTIQA plus people with their rights and actively challenges heteronormativity, stereotypes, harassment and discrimination. Visible allies and champions are important to the LGBTIQ plus community in that it helps them feel included and real participants in their community. Now, I'm going to shoot over these because of time. A lesbian, put simply, is a person who describes themselves as a woman and is attracted to other women. Again, avoid the language of homosexual, lesbianism and dyke. A gay man is a person who describes themselves as a man and is attracted to romantic, sexual and affection on other people who self-describe themselves as a man. Please stop using the word homosexuals. Takes the community back to when homosexuality was actually on the DSM-5. It was a mental illness. Rather not keep that side of the world ticking. Bisexual person is a person who is sexually and romantically and or emotionally attracted to people of the same sex or gender, as well as other people of other sexes or other genders. Now, this is a syntax point, and I note that. It's not bi-sexual, it's bisexual. Now, trans, trans-star and transgender are terms often used to describe people who are assigned a sex at birth that they do not feel reflects them in their sense of their gender identity. Their gender identity differs from their birth gender. Most trans people identify as women or men and don't have a trans identity or identifier. In practice, if someone says that they are a woman, they are a woman. If they are a man, they are a man. They may self-identify through the course of litigation that they are a trans man or a trans woman. That may be because of certain particularities of vulnerability which affects their case. I will get to that, and that relates to the shift document that you have in front of you as well. Again, avoid transgenders, transgendered, tranny, transvestite, she-male, crossdresser, she, him, it still happens, and transsexual. A prominent magistrate often likes to refer to trans women as transsexuals, which is somewhat frustrating. Now, we talked about multifactorial vulnerability. Brother boys and sister girls. Brother boys and sister girls are trans people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent whose spirits do not align with the sex that they are assigned at birth. Brother boys and sister girls have a strong cultural and spiritual identity. Their gender is separate from their sexual orientation. It's important to note that not all First Nation people who are gender diverse identify as brother boys and sister girls. Pansexuality and asexuality. Pansexuality explicitly recognises that sex and gender go beyond male-female binary, and not all people who are attracted to, but not all people are attracted to multiple sexes and genders will identify as such. Asexuality, it's recognised as an orientation, not a behavioural choice. That's the key point there. Now, I hope you all have the genderbread person in front of you. Now, this is an introductory presentation, and the reason why I've put this in front of you is for the following reasons. On the front of it, you actually see a wonderful point down on the left-hand side. Identity does not equal expression. It does not equal sex. Gender does not equal sexual orientation. Now, your gender identity is what is in your head. Attraction is what is in your heart. Anatomical sex speaks for itself. Who you are sexually attracted to you might be attracted to men or what is masculine, or you could be attracted to feminine or female people. And romantic attraction is separate again. So, I accept that I'm throwing a few curveballs to some people who might not have been involved in the LGBTIQA+ community. I just want to demystify something for people. Because of my privilege and because of the fact that 6'4", rugby playing, burly guy who is white, who grew up very middle class, means that I have and experience a level of privilege which I have gone on my own journey to learn these things through my exposure with the LGBTIQA+ community. It is forever evolving. We're doing more research and obtaining more information about concepts of gender, sexuality as we go. This is a moving feast as time goes on. And the most important thing that I want to say to you from this infographic is this. If you have a question, try to self-educate. There are a lot of resources out there. Approach myself, that we do have some other very well-known activists who work for legal aid, Matilda Alexander in Civil, who's involved in the LGBTI legal service. There are lots of resources when you're trying to unpack these questions, if you have any. Now, finding family. So that's a bit of that's a very, very quick explanation of all the letters, and I do accept that. Now, LGBTIQA+ Queenslanders create their family through previous heterosexual relationships, through parent transitions during relationships, through altruistic surrogacy, through adoption, and through child protection processes. It's important to note that outside of previous heterosexual relationships, finding family through surrogacy, adoption, and child protection processes is a relatively new phenomenon. And I refer to that, of course, with the development of family law in Australia. It's not that new, but it continues to be an evolving space. And a unique factor to LGBTIQA+ families is that a significant majority of those families are created through positive, intentional engagement with third parties to find a family. A key theme in LGBTIQA+ families is that concept of intentionality. It's very expensive to have a baby if you are in a same-sex relationship with a man, and it's very expensive for women who are in same-sex relationships. Now, the kids are all right. I can't emphasise that enough. So, children with lesbian or gay parents comprise of 0.1% of all dependent children in the population. 11% of gay men have children, Australian gay men have children, and 33% of Australian lesbians have children. It is accepted that children of same-sex parented families do well emotionally, socially and educationally, as well as their peers, from heterosexual couple families. So, the key message that came out of the Australian Institute Family of Studies of Same-Sex Parented Families in Australia is that family processes such as levels of conflict between parents and their divisions of labour are far more significant than the gender or sexual diverse characteristics of the parent when it comes to a child's well-being. Pretty straightforward. Now, I do have some case law, which I haven't included because I'm hoping that someone might take a note or something. There is the case of the marriage of Doyle and Doyle. That's 1992 in FLC 92 to 286. The central issue in that proceeding was the father's homosexuality and his consequent homosexual relationship. I know I just said don't refer to that. That's the case note. Okay? Wouldn't otherwise use that. So, it's important that the important point in that case is that the historical approach to gender and sexual diversity was succinctly summarised by Judge Hannon, who said, and I apologise, oh no, I did print it off on the other side, excellent. He says, the approach that homosexuality per se disqualifies a parent from having custody of a child has never been accepted in the determination of custody applications under the Family Law Act. It was a view which was specifically rejected by Justice Murray in Spry and Spry, in which, in an often quoted passage at page 76 of 404, that it is my view that lesbianism per se does not make a mother unfit to have custody, but it is a factor which cannot be ignored and must be taken into account with other factors that make up the total situation. In N&N, that's a 1977 case, Chief Justice Evatt succinctly put the prevailing view in Australia when she said, nevertheless, it, being the mother's lesbian relationship, was a fact for His Honour to weigh in the balance, not because of the suggestion of immorality, but because the relationship could be relevant if it were likely to affect the mother's ability to parent, or if it were likely to affect the children adversely. In Cartwright and Cartwright, again another 1977 case, Justice Smithers said, in all of them it was accepted that of itself lesbianism was not a determining or disqualifying factor, but merely another matter, albeit important, to be taken into account in deciding what was in the best interest of the children. So that's that case. That gives a very, very succinct view of the development of law in this area in Australia. And the more recent case of Triggs and Triggs, which was a case in the Family Court of Australia, where the applicant father transitioned to a woman, and the children who expressed a significant trauma in the way in which the transition was managed by the parent, and the child never wanted to be involved. It's a very, very sad case when you actually read through it. The court determined that court intervention would cause a much bigger issue in that forcing a child to recover his relationship with the parent may cause even more permanent deterioration of their relationship. I note that in the reasons for decision there was a significant discussion with respect to the biological father's insight into how her transition adversely affected the child and the steps or lack thereof that she took to take the child through that trauma was actually a determining factor in the case. So again, it's actually not about a person's gender identity or their trans status. It's actually in consideration of all the other factors of how a child is expressing their views, what is that parent actually doing to deal with a traumatic experience for the child? So, I will highlight that outside of case law, when we're talking about supporting the family unit, in Australia, we have a bit of a research gap. It is not something that we do a lot of research about because we don't have a lot of families who are prepared to participate in these kinds of studies. And again, it's a very small population subset. Researchers call for an increased attention to teacher, social worker and medical practitioner training about family diversity, including the need for service providers to avoid making assumptions about family relationships, and for inclusive language about gender and number of parents on relevant documentation. Health, community agency and education service providers, in order to better support LGBT parented families, need to encourage environments in which familial diversity is considered the norm rather than the exception. Again, that's from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, same-sex parented families in Australia. In preparing for this presentation, as an example, the most recent and up-to-date research that I could find on family violence in LGBTIQA plus families in Queensland was 2010. So there is a significant gap in research, in understanding of what the experience are for people in that community. So I'd like to point you to the other resource that I circulated, the SHIFT resource. Now, I don't have any left, no? No? Okay. I don't think I've printed enough, but if you could share, that would be great. So it's a silo that you can see. So in having a read of that, silo, as I'm sure you're all listening to me now, while I've given you something to look at, people who identify as gender or sexually diverse experience intimate partner violence, but is largely been not acknowledged until recent years. Some authors refer the heteronormative model of domestic and family violence as a barrier to reporting and to participating. And some authors refer to the societal homophobia and history of homophobia as a barrier to reporting and seeking assistance. Again, there is a lack of Australian data in this space. 41% of men in same-sex relationships report that they experience physical violence within a same-sex relationship. 27% of female participants in the same research indicated that they experienced physical violence in the same-sex relationship. And 25% of participants had experienced sexual assault within a same-sex intimate partner relationship. That's before they get in the door of reporting. And note that 61% of young people who identify as LGBTIQA+ report verbal abuse as a result of their gender identity or sexuality, and 80% reported the abuse occurred at their school, long before even we see them. And 24% report they had experienced verbal and physical abuse in the family home. That affects every single one of us who work in the domestic and family violence area. It's something to consider, and it is something that anecdotally I can confirm in our community that we are talking about, particularly for those communities who are culturally and ethnically diverse. And of course I refer to some of the Pacifica communities and the intersection between what would otherwise be accepted through cultural norms as a third gender. And I'm not great with pronouncing this correctly, but that's colloquially known as Fafas. So it's the third gender in Pacific, in the Pacifica community. So it's not linked to, it's a cultural third gender which is accepted, but unfortunately the rise of fundamentalism within their communities, religious fundamentalism within their communities, has actually placed them at a higher risk of family violence. Now, I'm actually going to talk about a few case examples, presuming that I have some time. I can't see a time thing anywhere.
It's all right.
We're good? Okay. I've been working in DV for coming up to 6 years in September as my primary interest area. Over the years I've worked with many different people. I'm going to refer to an example at duty lawyer in a regional court, which the Brisbane office and one of our regional officers attend. And in this case example, we had two people who had a long history of family violence between them. They had repartnered, they were married back in the late 90s, and they were forced to divorce as a result of their marriage not being accepted once the husband transitioned to female. They had to divorce. They were required by law to divorce. So they're already experiencing a fair level of homophobia and transphobia from the legal systems that were in place by the time they even walk in the door of said magistrate's court, who shall remain nameless. As these clients identify themselves as the aggrieved spouse and respondent spouse and the cross-aggrieved spouse and the cross-respondent spouse, the magistrate listens to submissions. We make submissions along the lines that the aggrieved and respondent are in an intimate personal relationship. There are cross-allegations of domestic violence. Both parties are in court, therefore necessary and desirable doesn't need to be heard. The magistrate looks down at both the parties and say, how does this work?
Oh. How long ago was this?
Last year. Similarly, before I worked for Legal Aid, I represented a young man who was in a non-traditional relationship. He was in a three-person relationship. During the course of the breakup of that three-person relationship, he was outed by his ex-partners on social media. They contacted his family, they sent them text messages, they contacted their friends and their sporting community that they're involved in. Said person was not too dissimilar to me. He was a big hulking block of footy player, and he did not and could not walk into the doors of the Brisbane Magistrates Court. Couldn't do it. Got to the front and said, no, I'm not putting myself in a situation where some judge is going to look at me and look at my family relationship and go, no, I'm not putting myself in a position where I get judged yet again because I was so far in my closet that I thought that this kind of relationship was normal. That's how internalised homophobia affects a person seeking assistance in real terms. So conversely, I assisted a client some time ago and a magistrate in another prominent court wouldn't make an order to prevent a person attending other gay venues in Brisbane, wouldn't make a not approach order because they're both men. So when you look at that infographic, it's real, it's there, and that's why people don't report. So if you are dealing with the people who identify as gender or sexually diverse, please keep that in mind. It's taken them a lot to just walk in the door, like any other vulnerable community that we serve. Now, what would you like? What do I want you to do with this information? Well, it's up to you. I would encourage everyone here to be conscious about how your words may impact on an LGBTIQA participant in the legal system or a client, and think about the way that you can support someone, particularly if you're in the capacity of duty law and you identify, someone self-identifies to you as being trans and they've been called in their documents by their dead name. Go to the registry. Tell the registry not to call them over the loudspeaker by their dead name. The dead name, for those people who don't know, is as part of your transition, as part of going through the legal process, you actually lose one name and change your identity documents. And something that we do see far too common is a situation where an aggrieved person will say all the terrible things that a respondent did and then name them by their dead name. So when the police come to the front door and knock on it and say, is Max here? Yes, I'm Max, but my name is Samantha. They have to out themselves again. And then they go to court, and then they speak to our court support workers, and then during that conversation, oh, you're not on the list, you're not on the list. I am. I'm Max, too. Then their name gets called over the loudspeaker, number 3. Then they go into court and explain that Max is them, number 4. Outed 4 times in a process. When I said we're constantly coming out, whether we like it or not, it happens. It's not all gloom and doom, it does get better. I can confirm that now that myself being open for 10 years, my openly gayness is now almost a teenager. And we are all working towards making access to justice and legal systems more accountable to the concept of diversity and inclusion. I will highlight that LGBTIQA plus issues, it's a piece of the broader puzzle of inclusion. We're one significant piece, as is cultural and ethnic diversity, as is women in the workplace, women's participation in society. We are part of a diverse conversation. We are a piece of that puzzle, and anything that I can do to answer questions. And the big thing that I will say is this: don't let fear of doing the wrong thing stop you from asking a question. people will out themselves to you along the course of litigation or along the course of participating in these processes. That's okay. The only tip that I would say is accepting someone is huge for someone who has already, by the time they've met you, 80% have experienced violence in their school. 41% of us experience poorer mental health compared to 20% in the general pop. The fact that we're even here and talking is a huge step for a lot of us and a lot of our community. But again, what I do highlight is that my presentation is somewhat influenced by the fact that I am also the most privileged in my community. So I do highlight that for everyone to think about. Thank you for having me.